So maize was first domesticated, maize or corn was first domesticated somewhere between 8 and 10,000 years ago in the Balsas Valley of Mexico. And actually, hold on, I have a prop. I didn't even know we were talking about maize. It just happens to be here. Okay. In this jar, if you can, I don't know if you can see it, in that jar is teosinte. These are the grains of the wild plant that was first domesticated to become maize as we know it today. So teosinte, which, believe it or not, if you just let your grass in your yard grow without mowing it all summer, some of the taller stuff that would grow up, it looks just like that. And the seeds would be almost the same size. So about 8 to 10,000 years ago, in the Balsas Valley of Mexico, there were some really innovative people that took those kernels of this teosinte plant, planted it, and selected it through generations of selecting for the traits that they desired, transformed that teosinte into domesticated maize, like very similar to how we know it today. The problem with maize is that it's one of the most difficult grains for the human body to derive maximum nutrition from. And anybody who's eaten corn on the cob in the summer and looked in the toilet the next day and saw whole kernels of corn in the toilet realized that two things: one, you don't chew your food enough, and two, your body it just took a ride in your digestive tract and landed in the toilet bowl the next day. We got no nutrition from that kernel of maize. But even if you took that maize and ground it up into cornmeal or boiled it and made polenta, I don't care, cornbread, I don't care what you do from it, there are nutrients in that maize that, without a very simple but powerful way of processing that we know is thousands and thousands of years old, it's called nixtamalization. Some of the nutrients in that maize pass directly through our body, and we don't get the nutrition from it. So I think it's one of the most powerful stories. And here's the story. So maize is the cornerstone of so many ancestral diets in the Americas for thousands and thousands of years. And Aztecs, for example, like maize was everything. It was religion, it was food, it was currency, it was status, it was every artwork, everything was focused on maize. It was so important and a huge part of their diet. And this is, again, coming from somebody who thinks, I'm convinced that a diet that is primarily made up of animal-based foods is the most nutrient-dense, bioavailable diet on the planet. But still, they were able to use maize processed the right way to create these entire civilizations. I mean, huge city-states be on the backs of this maize. Well, this goes on, obviously, and maize spreads throughout the Americas, South America, Central America, North America. And by the time that Columbus and the early European explorers come over to the New World, maize is widespread and everywhere, and it's being used in a lot of different forms. Well, the early explorers liked the maize, right? It tasted good. It was filling. It was very easy to grow. They realized that they had a very similar growing conditions in parts of Europe, right, with similar latitude, so they could take this maize back and plant it in Europe, and they thought that would be a great thing to do. So they do this 500 years ago. Well, what happened is something that they never could have imagined. So they take this maize back and they start growing it. And just like they thought, it grew in certain areas really, really well. People fell in love with it. It was a very cheap food. It was a filling food. It was a delicious food, and became the basis of a lot of diets for poor populations. And when some of these populations started subsisting primarily on maize, they started to get very, very sick with this brand new disease they never saw before in Europe. And the symptoms starts out as red, rashy skin. Parts of you start falling off. Early stages or some of this in the early years was confused with leprosy. Version of sunlight, bleeding from the mouth. Eventually, if it didn't get dealt with, blindness, and then finally death. And over several hundred years, millions of people got sick from this, and hundreds of thousands actually died. It was first identified in Spain. Then it was identified in populations in Italy, where it got its name pellagra, which means sour skin. And then we follow it spread throughout Europe. When you see maize spread throughout Europe into poor populations, and I say poor populations because it's happening where people are just eating maize and not getting nutrients from other places, you start seeing this. Then it shows up in the mid 1800s, at the end of the Irish potato famine, when the U.S. was sending massive amounts of maize or corn as famine relief food, and all of a sudden, people that were, populations that were dying from starvation because of the famine were now getting sick and dying of something else that they've never seen before. And then most recently, well, not most recently, but maybe closest to home, in the early 1900s, in the 1920s and 1930s, in the American Southeast, where corn was a huge, huge thing, especially in poorer populations, in places like the Carolinas and Alabama and Georgia and that area, where a lot of corn was being grown and consumed. We see pellagra hit for the first time in the Americas, really first time majorly in the Americas, which is very strange. So people are getting sick, people are dying. The government's very concerned about this brand new thing they never really saw before. And this is in our own country and only 100 years ago. It's not that long ago. And it's a story that most people don't know. So there was an infectious disease doctor by the name of Joseph Goldberger that was hired to figure out what this infectious disease was. It was killing all these Americans. And he came back after studying and he said, listen, I'm not the right person for this job. I'm an infectious disease doctor and this isn't infectious. I think it has to do with food. And I've read these accounts of these historical things happening in Europe. I think it has to do with corn. And the response was like, first off, nothing this bad can be the result of food. And it can't be corn. Corn is king. Go back and figure out what it is. So convinced that it had to be corn, he took several mental institutions and several prisons. This is something you can't do today, but you could do in the early 1900s. They divided the population in half in these places, very controlled populations. And half of the population in each one of these locations continued to eat whatever their diet was, which is probably very poor. And then the other half was fed nothing but corn. And the people who were eating nothing but corn started to show symptoms of pellagra and got sick. And he went back with this information, reported back, and the response was the same. Nope, this isn't it. It's something else. Figure out what it is. It's what we hired you to do. So the understanding of how infectious diseases were spread was strong enough in the early 1900s for him to know that if he was able to show that it wasn't spread through blood, wasn't spread through food, or through actually consumption of some sort of disease, and it wasn't spread through mucous membrane sorts of things, then hopefully he can convince people. So he and his partner and his wife would hold these parties in these towns. They called filth parties, and they'd have these stages, and they'd bring somebody up on the stage that was suffering from pellagra. And the first thing they do is that they would take a cotton swab and swab the mucous membranes of the sick person, and then swab themselves with the same one, right? And then the next thing that they would do is they take needles and pull blood out of the person that was sick and put it in their own veins. And then they had these like gel capsule-like things, and they take some of the scabby stuff that was falling off their bodies and put it in there, and then they would consume that. And then finally, the government listened. They realized it had to do something with corn. They couldn't figure out what it was, and it wasn't until a few years later that they realized it was because of an deficiency of niacin in the diet. I know this is a very long story, but here's the punchline and why it's so powerful. So here we find out that it's a deficiency of niacin in the diet, and the response. There's so many lessons from this. The government's response to this was, like it usually is, just to put a Band-Aid on a larger issue. So if you look at almost any baked good anywhere in this country, from Hawaiian rolls to Wonder Bread, it's going to say fortified with niacin on the bottom. So what we did when we realized that all these populations didn't have enough niacin in their diet, or in their bodies at least, that we fortified all these cheap bread-like things with niacin. And it seemed to solve the problem. But there's a larger issue. We have this, the ancient grain, the ancient maize, for thousands of years, consumed in massive quantities by so many people, and no evidence of pellagra, none whatsoever. It wasn't until that until that maize was taken from the New World, brought to the Old World, that we started seeing this disease hit the world stage. So what is the issue? And the issue is it's because of the processing, or actually the lack of processing. The food itself was taken without the context, without the way it's supposed to be processed. So the proper processing of maize, and the only one that makes the niacin in the maize available to the human body, and that's sort of the real punchline. I mean, the crazy thing is, over several hundred years, millions of people got sick, hundreds of thousands died from this disease that is caused by a deficiency of niacin in the diet, while eating massive quantities of a food that contain niacin. I mean, maize has actually quite a bit of niacin in it. It's just not available to the human body unless the maize is processed properly. So they were literally consuming and pooping out the very thing that, if they had it in their bodies, properly, it would have kept them from getting sick, the niacin. So the proper processing, the nixtamalization, is prehistorically was done. You take the maize, the dried maize, and just think like feed corn, that kind of thing, and you put it into a pot, and then it would have been a clay pot. Put water in the pot and put wood ash in the pot, brought it to a simmer because wood ash is alkaline, brought it to a simmer for about a half an hour, then took it off the fire, let it sit overnight. That's literally all you have to do. That's how simple it is. Today, you can replicate that same process with something called cal, or calcium hydroxide, which you can get at any Hispanic grocery store, or you can go get on Amazon, or you can go to Walmart and buy pickling lime. It's exactly the same thing. You take the maize, you put it in a pot, you put water in a pot, you put the pickling lime in there, which is so ash is potassium hydroxide. Cal is calcium hydroxide. Some large companies use lye, which is sodium hydroxide. But anything, they're all alkaline. You put you put the pickling lime in there, simmer it for half an hour, turn it off, let it sit overnight, and the next day you have a completely different food. And this thing, niacin, which is how it's naturally formed, and it turns to niacin and makes it bioavailable to the human body. Is it a very big deal? Not necessarily for somebody that's eating a very, very broad diet. But if you are eating massive quantities of tortillas, for example, or if you're eating massive quantities of maize, where a lot of these populations were for a very long time, it makes the difference between dying from a nutrient deficiency or being nourished. That one simple step that you can actually do over fire or do in your kitchen. So today, what does that mean? Well, a couple of great examples of where we've sort of fell short with that processing. All grits in this country were made using that process of nixtamalization until the Civil War. After the Civil War, for a variety of reasons, nobody does it anymore. So any grits you would buy, almost any grits you would buy from the store or at a restaurant, have not been nixtamalized. Cornmeal has not been nixtamalized. Anything going into a corn chip has not been nixtamalized. Anytime you're baking with the cornmeal, so you're putting out, and again, it's not a very big deal randomly here and there, but there's no reason I don't see a reason to make a food and intentionally, now that everybody knows it, you have this sort of responsibility, and skip a step that could mean the difference between getting all the maximum nourishment from that food or not. We can dive. I don't know how far you want to go into it, but we can talk about different foods. We could talk about how to change that out and why these tortillas today are falling short. But
well, let's stay on this for a little bit. I have a couple follow-up questions.
Sure.
If the corn has been nixtamalized, you talked about seeing it in the toilet earlier. We know that this helps with the niacin, but is corn at that point something you'd consider part of a healthy diet? And does it help with digestion?
Maybe I can answer that question this way first, because I taught college for 20 years, and the first thing I did, and maybe I should have started, the first thing I did in the beginning of every class was I taught archaeology and anthropology. So one of the things I made sure that the students realize is that any information they get, no matter how they get it, is biased. It is inherently biased. We are all human. Everything is biased. Somebody suggesting that they're not biased right away, you can't believe something that they're saying. So the best thing that they can do is learn as much as they can about the source so they can evaluate that information for themselves. So no matter what we were talking about, I made sure the very first day of class, whatever the class was, I wanted the students to know what my stance was on these things so that no matter what came out of my mouth for the rest of the semester, they could evaluate for themselves, what they did with that information. So let me be very clear about what I think is the safest, most nutrient-dense, bioavailable, sustainable diet on the planet. To me, it is one that is focused on animal-based resources, and those animal-based resources are coming to you from a complete nose-to-tail approach where the entire animal is being utilized. And to me, that is not only the most nutritious diet possible, but the most ethical and sustainable way to consume or include animals in your diet. That said, I don't think from a biological perspective, sugar has any place in our diet. I don't think there is a human requirement for carbohydrates whatsoever. And I think plants are inherently dangerous because every single plant on the planet has some sort of toxin in it. And when they do have nutrients that our bodies could use, they are locked up and are very difficult for our bodies to access without some sort of preparation. So that means if we're going to include plants in our diets, we need to be selective about what plants we consume, and we need to be very deliberate about how we process that plant before it goes into our mouths. So from a nutritional safety, thriving perspective, that is my take. However, one of the other things that's complicated about humans is that food is so intertwined with literally everything it means to be human. Like, we cannot separate food from pleasure, food from discomfort, food from romance, food from politics, food from religion, food from tradition. Everything is intertwined. So that means that there's another element, there are a lot of other elements that we need to take into account when we're talking about being fully nourished. Some of it is the nutritional, takeaway from the food that we're eating, but the cultural needs and our emotional needs that we need to make sure that we satisfy to be fully nourished can't be discounted. So that said, I probably, I love Anthony Chaffee's work. I think he's brilliant. He's doing, I mean, I don't know how many years he's been full carnivore, and I've eaten many meals with him. And I mean, he's the real deal. If he says he's eaten meat and salt, like literally that's it. Right. And he's in amazing shape. I love Brussels sprouts. Like, I love the smell of Brussels sprouts. I love the taste of Brussels sprouts. I love eating them. So is there something that, do I need to take that into account? Absolutely. There was a year, I wrote about it in my book, but there was a year that I was so hardcore about my diet, actually several years, that I didn't even eat I didn't even have a bite of birthday cake when my kids were little for several years. And one of the years, and this is kind of literally a low point for me, so I have three kids. I have my oldest daughter is Brianna, my son is Billy, my youngest daughter is Alyssa. My oldest daughter, and I forget how old she was at the time, maybe 10, had made the birthday cake for her younger sister, and I didn't even eat a bite of that cake. And from a nutritional perspective, of course, it makes sense. I mean, she probably made the icing, knowing her, but I mean, it was completely refined sugar, and there was zero reason from a nutritional perspective I should have eaten that. But from a cultural and emotional perspective, 100% I should have eaten that cake. I should have eaten the entire slice of that cake, not just a bite. So we need to take all these things into account. So that's, now we'll get back. Your question was about, is maize part of a healthy diet? Well, from a cultural perspective, there's a lot of people where they couldn't escape from maize even if they wanted to, right? And they actually love the smell of real maize, the taste of real maize, the texture of real maize, processed properly. So there's all of those pieces as well. I do eat maize. I don't eat a lot of it, but anytime I eat it, it's coming from a really good source. Like the maize that we process here at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, we import heirloom land-raised maize from Mexico. Most of it's coming from Oaxaca. It's a very ancient breed of maize, and it's organic, and it's grown by and the money's going directly back to the farmers that are growing it, and then we nixtamalize it, and then we put it through the rest of the steps depending on how we're going to make it. I don't eat a lot of it, but I do think eating it in that state can absolutely be part of a healthy diet. But when you start to get that, when it becomes more clear and you gain some clarity on what real food processed to maximize the safety, nutrient density, and bioavailability of that food, what that actually is, you really start to see the difference between things like grocery store bread and sourdough bread, or Goya tortillas and a real nixtamalized hand stone ground tortilla made from heirloom maize. They're completely different foods. Raw A2 milk and skim milk, ultra pasteurized, homogenized skim milk from the grocery store. And that's I think in these conversations about food and diet and health, that's the next step. Because right now, so many of us are having what we think are incredibly important conversations like, hey, do you think humans should be consuming dairy as adults? Or do you think, can bread be a part of a healthy human diet? And all of those conversations are meaningless in my mind, because what do you mean when you say bread? You mean Wonder Bread or wild fermented, long, slow fermented sourdough bread that's made with really incredible grains? Completely different food. The short answer is maize processed properly, I do believe can absolutely be a part of a healthy human diet and hit all of those levels, and that it is a completely different food from anything else you would have made out of maize.
So we'll stay on maize a little bit longer. We take maize, we put it through the processing. Is there any way at that point, I'm assuming it's taken off the cob to process, but for people over here in the West that are used to corn on the cob, making popcorn, is there a way to process and then keep the maize in that original form to be able to have these things, or no?
Well, maize. I think the story about the maize and the pellagra is a powerful story, but maize does get a little complicated. So let me do my best. So first off, corn on the cob compared to the maize that I'm talking about are different things. Corn on the cob is, first of all, in almost all cases, is a different variety of corn. But more importantly, it is an unripe variety of unripe corn on the cob, right? It hasn't gone through the entire maturation process. And the way it's been described to me, and I think it's a great way to think about it, at that point, think about it more like a fruit than a grain, right? Because one of the reasons it's loaded with sugar. And most of us, reality is most of us are not eating that corn on the cob to really get a lot of nutrition. We like the bite, we like the flavor, we like sitting there chewing on it, and we're getting more nutrition from the butter than we are actually from the corn. So there's really not much. If you like, there's not much dangerous about corn on the cob. There's other grains I would be more worried about than corn or maize, with things like lectins and phytates and the like. Corn is fairly benign in that sense. So from a safety perspective, I'm not very concerned with corn on the cob, but do understand that if you're eating corn on the cob, the biggest thing you're getting from it is the pleasure of actually eating it. You're not really getting much else. And again, you can see that the remnants of that in the toilet the next day. The popcorn is an interesting one, and there's zero way, I can't even fathom a way to nixtamalize popcorn and still have it pop. But what you can do, and it's actually delicious, is sprouting is a fantastic way to start to begin to detoxify a lot of grains and seeds and nuts and that sort of thing. You can sprout popcorn, and you can actually buy sprouted popcorn, and it pops just like unsprouted popcorn. So there is a little bit to that. So if you want to take one step in the popcorn world towards something that is a little bit safer and a little bit healthier, then get sprouted popcorn. Otherwise, anything else you do with that maize or that corn, like from a dried state, can be nixtamalized. So what we do here, so we take the maize, we nixtamalize it overnight. Then the next day, so what happens overnight is there's a lot of chemical and physical changes happening to that maize. And one of the other things that happens is the outer skin on the maize begins to almost dissolve and fluff off of the maize itself. So the next day you rinse all that off. The stuff that we're making into tortillas, there's no gluten obviously in maize, and there's nothing to really bind it together. So we rinse off those slimy, like leftover pieces of skin actually work really well to help bind everything together. So the maize that we rinse to then grind into masa and make our tortillas, we keep about half the skins on there. We rinse some of them off, and then we stone grind that, and then we press that and cook that into tortillas. The tortillas that are left over after that, we then cut and fry in lard and make our tortilla chips out of. The other whole kernels of maize, some of them we rinse completely all the skins off, partially dry them, and fry them in lard and make a really healthy version of corn nuts. They're delicious. Some of them we take and we put into a food processor and grind up, but not as fine as the stone ground stuff. And we use those as grits, and we make our grits with that. And they're absolutely delicious grits. The cool thing about the nixtamalization process is that it helps detoxify. It helps pre-digest, which means our bodies don't have to work so hard to continue to break down that corn, which we already know is really difficult for the human body to fully break down. And it releases the niacin to our bodies and some of the other nutrients as well, but also niacin. And because of the way that we're processing it with the cal or the calcium hydroxide, it actually has a higher calcium content than anything else we'd eat with just the corn. And that calcium is bioavailable to our bodies. So from a nutritional perspective, it's 15 different wins over on this side. But the other cool thing is it has an aroma and a texture that you can only get pleasing on both accounts by going through that nixtamalization process. The word actually tamale is in the middle of nixtamalization, and traditional real tamales were nixtamalized. Traditional tortillas were nixtamalized. Anything you would use masa dough for has been nixtamalized. But here's the next more complicated thing, because somebody listening to this would say, "Oh, well, I've bought the maseca, the dried maize flour, and that's been nixtamalized. So how is that for me?" Here's the problem with the maseca. And so if anybody's ever been to a Hispanic grocery store, depending on where you live, your local neighborhood grocery store might carry it as well. It's usually in the flour section where the flowers are, or if there's a health food section, you might have some there. Bob's Red Mills makes some. So what maseca is, masa just means dough, right? So maseca is dried dough. So it's dried nixtamalized maize that's in the bag. The problem with that is, in almost all cases, all of the nutrients in that maize have been sifted out. It's the white flour version of nixtamalized maize, and the reason is just like the reason the food system is pushing white flour so hard is because it's incredibly storable. As soon as you crack open the germ of the wheat berry, it releases oils, and those oils can turn rancid. So the shelf life of whole wheat flour is a fraction of what the shelf life of white flour is. Almost all of the masecas, the dried masa flour that you can just add water and make the tortillas from, have the germ and the bran have been taken off, and it's literally just the endosperm. It's just the starch. So you're getting the Wonder Bread version of this. So yes, it's been nixtamalized, but most of the nutrients aren't there because they've been sifted out. The cool thing is it's incredibly easy to do in your own home. Like it's super easy. And if you look really, really hard, there's more and more really high quality tortillerias popping up in different places around the country where you can go and actually get incredible tortillas that are made properly. And if none of those things work for you, then check on our website, and we actually ship them there, and they're delicious, but they're completely different foods. And let me just also say this for people that are thinking of some of this, because I know I dive down these rabbit holes because I'm passionate about it, but it does seem overwhelming at some time. I am not suggesting that if you only eat tortillas every now and then, that the tortillas that you're getting at the grocery store are going to kill you. That's not the point. The point is there is a more nourishing and, by the way, more delicious version of the tortillas than most of us have access to. And if you're going to eat a tortilla, you're going to eat a tamale, you're going to eat a tortilla chip, then that's exactly what you should be going for. A quick other side note, just to show you how screwed up our food system is. According to the FDA, you are not allowed to call something a tortilla chip. So tortilla chips are required to use nixtamalized maize to make them. The difference, according to the FDA, between a tortilla chip and a corn chip is that a tortilla chip has been nixtamalized. But in almost all cases, it's been nixtamalized. The germ and everything has been gone. And if you think about how fine, the tortilla chips, how white they are, how yellow they are, with no specks of any, there's nothing that resembles any part of the germ in there at all. It is pretty much nutritionless, but it has been nixtamalized. But the other part of the regulation is if you're going to call it a tortilla chip, it by definition has to be fried in vegetable oil. Isn't that crazy? You're talking about a food that's coming from such a long-standing tradition of, in Mexico, you would have never used vegetable oil. Like, they didn't have access to it. Everything was fried in lard. But in this country, you cannot call it a tortilla chip unless it's been fried in some sort of industrial nut or seed oil, which is insane. But so we call them totopas or or nixtamalized maize chips or whatever. But anyhow, just as for people shopping, it's something to look for.
So for somebody that decides to take this on, they nixtamalize their own corn. They get whatever they need to do that, including this agent to detoxify the maize. Any other plants get processed in this way?
Anybody who's been following some of the restaurant scene for the past 10 years would know the name Noma, right? It was best restaurant in the world for multiple years. It was in Copenhagen, and they had a food lab associated with it in the very beginning called the Nordic Food Lab. They apply, one of the great things that they've done is that they have applied all sorts of traditional and ancestral approaches to things, to the resources that they have in Mexico. Oh, I'm sorry, not Mexico, in the Nordic countries, and especially in Denmark. And so they started a program of nixtamalizing all sorts of grains there that are local to places like Denmark. And they had some success. They're doing some things, I think, with rye and some other. But it turns out, and I dove really, really deep into this, the biggest value that nixtamalization provides is really only appropriate for maize. Other things like sprouting or soaking or fermenting with the bacterial bacteria as well as yeast make the biggest difference with a lot of the other grains. So really, nixtamalization is a big thing for maize, but I don't think it makes a big difference in other cases.
How does high fructose corn syrup come into play with all this? Obviously, somebody like you, somebody like me, we're not eating processed foods, but they are a big part of the diet over here in the West. A lot of people are consuming them. Corn is in the name, high fructose corn syrup. Is this even an issue? That's obviously a toxic, quote unquote, food as it is. But does this processing of corn, I'm assuming they don't do that with what they make into the syrup, but is there any interaction there?
There's no relationship between nixtamalization and the craziness that goes into making high fructose corn syrup. But I think the question is a great question on a lot of different levels, and maybe one way to use it as a spark for some really good takeaways is maybe another way to ask it. At what point does processing food become bad? Because again, I'm championing processing food. I mean, in fact, I'm suggesting that there's no way to be a fully nourished human without some level of processing in our diets. But then, at what point does it go bad? So, when the story that I usually tell, and it's a powerful story for me, and I think so many of us use terms and phrases all the time and not realize without realizing that we haven't really defined it for ourselves, right? And sometimes we get called on it. So there was one year, and it was years ago. I was teaching a full load of anthropology classes at the college, and this one semester I was teaching a prehistoric archaeology class, and one of the other classes that semester was something on modern food systems, an anthropology class. I forget exactly what class it was, but I remember that I had the same student in both classes that semester. So very different material that was being presented in both classes, but there was some overlap as well. And at about 3 or 4 weeks into the semester, the student, she came up to me after class. She goes, "Professor Schindler, I have a question for you. I just don't understand something." I said, "What?" She says, "Look, in the archaeology, you say food processing all the time. And in the archaeology class, when you say food processing, you light up. You're excited, and you're saying about how, always talking about how wonderful it is. But in the modern food systems class, every time you say food processing, you get all pissed off, and it looks like somebody ran your dog over with a car. Like, I don't understand. Like, what's the difference?" And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I haven't thought about it. Like, there's definitely some line that needs to be drawn, but I don't know where that line is. So let me think about it and get back to you. So I thought about it. It actually took me a couple weeks to figure out where I drew the line. So this is where I draw the line. And when I say food processing, I mean everything from literally busting open a rock and using a sharp edge to cut something with, to putting something on a fire or putting it in a pit in the ground to ferment it. So these are very basic ways of for processing food. And then now we have things like people in lab coats and ultra processing stuff and making corn syrup and all the other nonsense. So where does that line drawn? So this is where the line is drawn for me. Food processing, and let me back up one of them. It's very hard to talk about some of the things that I talk about because 3.5 million years worth of time is a very long period of time. And there is a massive amount of diversity I'm making statements where I'm putting all together in one statement, 3.5 million years worth of diversity. And on a global scale, people everywhere doing all sorts of things. I don't mean to overly simplify some of this, but most of the food processing technologies for the majority of 3.5 million years were focused on making foods safer, making foods more nutrient dense, and making the nutrients in the foods more bioavailable. Period. Like in many cases, it did all three at the same time. To me, that's the positive food processing. All right, the food ultra processed foods and the food processing that is going on today that is very upsetting to me and I think is making us very sick are processing foods for other reasons, right? Things like making other people rich or increasing shelf life or being able to ship things without them getting bruised or all sorts of things, making people addicted to food, whatever. But the most important takeaway is that they're doing that at the expense of those three key elements of what food processing was in the past. Remember, safety, increasing nutrient density, and increasing nutrient bioavailability. So I could care less if somebody's figured out something to do with food and they're getting rich on it. Awesome. As long as it's not at the expense of one or all of those things. So I hope that clears some stuff up for people because food processing is very much an important part of our lives today. And we do have to be able to separate that one from the other. And I think another way to think to really sort of put a picture in your mind of, okay, what's good and what's bad is, and it's much more complicated than good and bad, but what's good and what's bad is anything that you eat, you should be able to make in your house, period. I'm not saying that you should be able to make it in your house because you necessarily have the knowledge or the skill set to be able to do it, but you should be able to do it in your house if you knew what you were doing. If it requires a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment and somebody in a lab coat with a PhD to actually make that food, then I would question whether it should go into your body.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
We are literally the only species on the planet that hires somebody else to tell us what to eat. And we are the sickest we've ever been, despite that, or probably as a result of that. If you are carnivore, if you are keto, if you are vegan, if you are vegetarian,